you to all of you for joining us here today at the Wilson Center for our panel on cross-border intergroup conflicts in the Horn of Africa, a case study of Ethiopia-South Sudan Borderland people. My name is Monde Muyangwa, and I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program, and I welcome you all to this event. I also want to welcome those of you joining us on Twitter. You can follow our live tweets on the Africa program's Twitter account at Africa Up Close, and you can contribute to the discussion using the hashtag cross-border conflict, all one word. I want to take a moment to recognize and welcome some special friends of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Princeton Lyman, Ambassador Shin. Thank you very much for coming. I think we have half the knowledge on the Horn of Africa embodied in those two people right there. And I welcome you both, and thank you for coming to this discussion. So at the Wilson Center, we seek to provide a space for inclusive dialogue and analysis to better inform policy debates on pressing global issues. And today's event, under the banner of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, embodies that mission. The Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding was established in 2011 with the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and it is a consortium of 21 research and policy organizations from across Africa. Coordinated by the Wilson Center's Africa program, the network seeks to support the development of informed and mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa policy and to increase the visibility of African perspectives within the U.S. policy arena, particularly around issues of peace building and state building. One of the main components of the Southern Voices Network for Peace Building is the scholarship program, through which the Wilson Center hosts scholars from member organizations for a 3-month residence here in Washington, D.C. The scholarship provides our young scholars with the opportunity to complete a research project and to engage with U.S. policymakers and practitioners in their field of interest, thus providing them with exposure and visibility while simultaneously bringing local context and knowledge to inform U.S. discussions on peace building in Africa. And so one of our speakers here today is here under the program, and he is just concluding his time with us at the Wilson Center at the end of November, and so he is making his public presentation today. The theme of today's event is cross-border intergroup conflicts in the Horn of Africa, and in that context, our speakers will explore the nature of conflict in the region at large, highlight the conflict as it's playing out at the cross-border area of the Gambela region between Ethiopia and South Sudan, but also offer some potential solutions with regard to the roles of local communities, national governments, and international partners in increasing security and mitigating violence and conflict in the region. I think many of you are here today because you do know that the Horn of Africa is one of the most unstable regions in Africa and in the world. But too often, I think, our focus has been on that big 30,000 view of the conflict and the instability in the Horn of Africa. And I think what we're trying to do here today is find a way of analyzing the conflict and instability at that big macro level picture, but also understanding what's going on in local communities with regard to conflict and how that both informs and is impacted by the larger conflict picture. So we're joined here today by 3 speakers who've done a lot of work in the Horn of Africa, and they bring different perspectives to this issue, which should serve to enrich our discussion. So in the interest of time, I'm going to just give a short introduction of each person and the questions that they've been asked to address, but you can find their full bios in the program. We've asked each panelist to speak for 10 minutes, after which we'll have a moderated question and answer session with you, the audience. With that, let me very quickly introduce our speakers, and I'll do so in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker is Dr. E.J. Hogendoorn, who is the Deputy Director, Program Director for Africa at the International Crisis Group. He previously served as the International Crisis Group's Horn of Africa Project Director, and we've asked him to provide a broad overview of the challenges to peace and security in the Horn of Africa, give us a sense of how insecurity and conflict manifest themselves in the borderland regions, and to offer his perspectives on how international organizations and other local groups can work together to most effectively mitigate conflict and promote regional stability. Our second speaker will be Ms. Varalakshmi Vemuru, who is a senior social development specialist with the World Bank's Global Practice on Urban, Social, and Rural Resilience. She is currently leading the World Bank's response to address forced displacement in the Horn of Africa, and we have asked her to speak to insecurity and conflict in the region, particularly as they relate to migration and forced displacement, and to offer some recommendations on how best to build resilience, inclusive development, and governance in the larger Horn of Africa. Our third and final speaker is Mr. Tasew Gashaw, who is the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Scholar. He's currently working on his PhD at Addis Ababa University in Peace and Security, and he will speak more directly to the issue of cross-border intergroup conflict in the Horn of Africa, with a specific focus on Ethiopia-South Sudan Borderland regions. With that, let me invite Dr. EJ to kick us off. EJ?
Thank you. Oh, I don't have to push a button. Great. It's way too high-tech for me. Well, anyway, thank you very much for joining us for this panel presentation. I have been asked to talk a little bit about the regional dynamics and how I've seen those develop over the last 5-10 years, and particularly how those impact dynamics going forward. Just to state the obvious, you know, as Monde has mentioned, the Horn has been a region that has been quite troubled for many, many decades. It is very much a region that I would like to characterize as a Hobbesian one, where the friend of my friend, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and where I think most states have utilized proxy actors at one point in time, either to push their particular policy or their particular regional goals, or at least to undermine their rivals whenever they could. And I think that, unfortunately, that culture still pervades. Have been long-term historic rivalries that continue to play a profound role in terms of the understanding not just of the regional actors, but also of those international actors that have influence in the Horn of Africa. And particularly, those are regional rivalries between Egypt and Ethiopia, between Eritrea and Ethiopia now, between the Middle East and Ethiopia to a certain degree, very much mirrored onto a religious divide, at least a perceived religious divide. And I think these are all ones that are quite important to understand and to appreciate when one is trying to ascertain where all these developments are going. As people know, there was a long-term proxy conflict in Ethiopia that was only really ended by the fall of the GERD. I'm sorry, of the previous regime and the takeover by Meles Zenawi. There has been a long-term conflict in the Sudans, both in South Sudan but also in Darfur. And there has been a long-term conflict in Somalia. And unfortunately, all of those conflicts continue in one way or another, as we will discuss probably in greater detail. The civil war that's continuing in South Sudan has a lot of regional linkages that continue that fighting, and even though the fighting has subsided to a certain degree, part of the calculations that are driving the combatants and are undermining efforts to promote peace is a perception by leaders, particularly in the various rebellions, that if they only wait long enough, they will be able to find yet another state sponsor to strengthen their insurgencies and to strengthen their hand at the bargaining table. The same thing to some degree is happening in Somalia as well. I'll speak to that a little bit. And we are again seeing a reemergence of conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea that I'll also deal with in a little bit. Now, what I think is quite interesting, and the reason why I wanted to be on this panel, is I would argue that beyond kind of these historic amenities, there are two newer dynamics that have that have appeared over the last couple of years that I think are going to have a profound impact on the Horn and perhaps a pretty negative impact as well. The first one is one that's probably familiar to many of you. It's the decision by the Ethiopian government to build a dam on the Blue Nile called the Grand Renaissance Dam. I won't get into whether or not that was the right decision or not. That's contested by the regional states. But the reality is that this dam has raised tensions between particularly Ethiopia and Egypt tremendously. There is, to some degree, a fait accompli in that it is quite likely that the dam will be completed relatively soon. But it raises two fairly significant questions for Egypt that are now very much influencing its posture vis-a-vis Ethiopia and in the region as a whole. The first is the question of the so-called fill rate of the reservoir behind the dam. So how quickly is Ethiopia going to fill this reservoir, and what does that mean for the flow of water downstream for Egypt? Just to state the obvious, the Nile is the biggest, the only real major source of water for Egypt. And that continued flow is considered an existential question for Cairo. Obviously, the faster the reservoir is filled, the more it's going to reduce the water that flows downstream. And this has become a very, very significant question in Cairo. It is influencing decisions that Egypt has made as to what kind of alliances it is entering into. It has influenced Egypt's decision to get close to Salva Kiir in South Sudan. It has also influenced Egypt's decision to get relatively close to President Isaias in Eritrea. And, whether or what really those links mean to some degree is moot because this is seen in a very, very negative light by Addis Ababa. And so what we have is a return to these kind of Hobbesian logics of, well, Egypt is in South Sudan, it's my enemy because of these water politics, and so I am going to assume it's doing the worst, and when I assume they're doing the worst, I'm signaling to Cairo that I'm going to also do the worst counter move, and this, of course, can get us into a very, very negative spiral. As I've mentioned, this is not just an issue in Cairo, this is also an issue in Addis Ababa, and if you speak to Ethiopian policymakers, they very, very much view Egypt's efforts in South Sudan and in Eritrea in a very, very negative way. Oops, shoot, I've already run out of time. So I think one just needs to recognize that that's a major concern. But what I think is also a concern, and what's less discussed and what I would like to raise, is that it also raises very significant longer-term concerns for Egypt as well. Right now, all the people are concerned about is this so-called fill rate of this hydroelectric dam, which would presume that once the reservoir is filled, and essentially you just get water circulating through the dam for hydro production, that would no longer influence the water usage by Ethiopia. For a variety of complicated reasons, Ethiopia cannot use the reservoir behind the Gur Dam for irrigation purposes. But what can happen, and what is in fact happening, is that with a more regular flow of water downstream, you are seeing a lot of players, particularly in the Middle East, becoming very interested in agricultural developments on the Blue Nile in Sudan in particular. And I would argue that that is also a major concern in Egypt, and it's a major source of tension between Egypt and Sudan. But moving on very quickly, since I've run out of time, I think the other development that people should be aware of, it might be obvious, but I want to state it anyway, is that beyond kind of regional tensions, the Horn has also now become the source of tensions between Middle Eastern middle powers, particularly between the Saudis and the Emiratis on one side and the Qataris and its allies on the other. And that Middle Eastern petropolitics and petro-foreign affairs and relations are really, really significantly destabilizing hitherto somewhat stable relations and political calculations amongst most of the major players. This has had a significant impact in Sudan, where Sudan, for a number of reasons, pivoted quite rapidly from being a friend of Iran to becoming a fast friend of Saudi Arabia and becoming heavily involved in the war in Yemen. It's also had significant impacts in Somalia, where now we're seeing an incredibly destabilizing contest for influence in particularly South and Central Somalia between friends of the Somali federal government and those other countries that have been kind of left out in the cold, now going directly to the so-called federal member states, so the subnational entities of the federal government, and that's having an incredibly destabilizing impact on the efforts by the federal government to build or to rebuild the state and to fight al-Shabaab. And this is also having a relatively destabilizing impact on relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea, where hitherto Ethiopia had relatively effectively been able to isolate Eritrea regionally and internationally. But now Eritrea has become the best friend, particularly of the United Arab Emirates, become heavily involved also in the war in Yemen, and has again changed these power dynamics between these two very important states. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that politics have, if at all possible, become even more complicated in the region, and we have a significant coordination problem. The problem is that the region is usually represented, at least in Western capitals, by a number of organizations, by the Intergovernmental Association for Development, IGAD, so that's the regional body that usually represents East Africa or the Greater Horn. Sometimes it's represented by the African Union. But now if you're bringing in Middle Eastern equities, and of course I haven't even discussed Western powers and the current dynamics on the global stage, who's going to play that coordination role? You know, is it going to be IGAD? No, it cannot be IGAD because it doesn't deal with the Middle East, or it doesn't deal with Egypt, for example. The AU? No, because it just deals with the African continent. Well, then what body do you have above that? The League of Arab States? No, that doesn't work. The Organization for Islamic Cooperation? That doesn't work, let alone would those be the appropriate bodies. And then you've got the UN, but of course the UN is also troubled by disunity within the Security Council. So I think you have some very significant challenges. What does that mean for the last question that I was given in 1 minute or less? Well, again, to restate the obvious, we have an incredibly difficult coordination problem in terms of trying to get different states with very, very significant stakes in the region to try to work cooperatively together on resolving some of these conflicts. And the problem is that these conflicts aren't just within states, but oftentimes they spill over very much, as will be discussed by our panelists. And so you have issues that cannot be dealt within traditional diplomatic silos and thus need to be worked on a regional basis. But again, when you have so many different actors getting involved, it becomes a very significant problem. The other issue that I think, and this is one that some of you may have heard me talk about, within this coordination problem, you have a significant issue in terms of lack of confidence and mistrust between the multiple players. And unfortunately, the region as a whole has never had a mechanism in which it can try to build confidence between different states and try to cut into these negative cycles of assuming the worst about one's rivals intentions in a particular region. So to make this a bit more concrete, Ethiopia is assuming Egypt is up to no good in South Sudan because it has no confidence in Egypt's intentions. It has also no ability, or there is no other organization out there that's in a position to be able to speak to Ethiopia in an impartial way and say, well, we know actually what the Egyptians are doing in South Sudan, and they're not actually doing the worst thing that you think they are. They have certain interests that they are pursuing, which are quite reasonable from an independent perspective. But, you don't know that because, again, of this mistrust. And so I really do think that something on the order of an organization for security and cooperation in the Horn of Africa would be something quite useful to try to establish, or for the AU to get involved in. Last but not least, obviously that would be a pretty ambitious project. I do think that there is a much, much greater role for international organizations, particularly international NGOs that are independent, groups like mine, but certainly not only, Crisis Group, to be working on these issues, to be promoting transparency, to be working on these issues from an impartial perspective, and to try to put out analysis that questions whether or not everything that's happening in the Horn is done because of worst case scenarios and because different actors want to do the most harm to their rivals rather than to pursue relatively understandable policies that further their national interest and perhaps even the interest of the region. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. EJ. Ms. Farah, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. Good morning, everyone. From the World Bank's perspective, I'm just coming to this issue from an operational angle in terms of what have we done, what have we learned in the region. I mean, one thing is very, very clear, that forced displacement and mixed migration probably is the most complex and pressing regional challenge for the region and for the Horn of Africa. And it's very clear that there are so many regional spillover effects. South Sudan now, the refugee numbers are almost 1.5 million, and every single country in the neighborhood hosts them except probably Eritrea. And I think what's also important to note is that, and I guess all of you do appreciate, is that it's the endemic armed conflict is one part, but I think the region has other set of circumstances, poor governance, environmental degradation. I mean, it's one of the regions that's most prone to climate change risks. Food insecurity, lack of economic opportunities, they are all triggers for conflict-affected populations to move. And I think one of the realities of that region that I think is now getting more recognition is that there are blurring lines, if I would say, that between forced displacement and conflict, what we call involuntary migration and voluntary migration. So forced displacement and mixed migration, we may want to look at them as two different phenomena, but on the ground, when one sees it, the lines are pretty blurred. I mean, whether people move because of conflict or war or persecution versus people move because of poverty, erosion of livelihoods, or climate change has basically destroyed or degraded whatever little assets they've been left. So we could call that involuntary migration, but then there is also voluntary migration. I mean, people just do not want to take status quo. They want something different. And Djibouti and Oboxy, 100,000 people move every year. And what we've seen is the Yemeni crisis, at least my conversation there didn't really deter people from moving. All it did was it made the movement much more expensive. So that's the reality that one is dealing with in the region. And you have 8 countries, 4 that probably are the producers of refugees, if I might say. They are the origin countries for refugees, and the rest of them are hosting refugees, and there is a cost too. So in that sense, it is a continuum that's happening in the region, and of involuntary and voluntary migration, or forced migration, as we are now calling it. And there needs to be coordinated responses in places of origin, and that also includes countries which are currently hosting refugees. I mean, Ethiopia hosts refugees, but Ethiopians constitute almost 80% of those people who move through a BOC to other areas. So that's a reality that one is dealing with in the region. Now, not all migration is benign. We know the kind of trafficking, the kind of issues both men and women face, and it's quite harrowing. Now, based on a study that we did in 2015 on this whole phenomenon of forced displacement, mixed migration, I want to reflect on what it means for the people on the ground. And I had the privilege of, I think, traveling to 75% of the refugee camps or more in the region. I mean, in many camps, 25 years or more is what refugees have been staying. There's a total erosion of human capital. I mean, skills, capacities, I mean, there really isn't anything. I mean, people do lead desperate lives. And so you're not too surprised when refugees embark on a more perilous journey of, trying to become migrants, from their first movements. And in almost every single country, refugee camps are in border areas of the host countries. They're poor, underserved, underrepresented. I mean, they face issues of their own, and then you have this additional burden coming in where services are already scarce, environment is totally degraded. And that's when the social cohesion goes for a toss. I mean, there is a huge problem. And the presence of refugees for very, very long has had a huge impact on host communities. I mean, initially there was always an issue of reciprocity, but then 25 years erodes those sentiments as well. It's not all movements have been negative. I mean, there is a real refugee economy that's at work. You look at the Dadaab, $100 million are invested in that refugee camp. So, I mean, it creates an economy of its own around it. But on what terms do the host communities then interact with the refugees or refugee camp and the people who run either the UNHCR or the NGOs is a different conversation, right? So from a World Bank perspective, we've been looking at analytics for some time. It was 5 years ago when we really started looking at these issues. We work on countries like Somalia and South Sudan to look at areas to, in fact, try and bring some stability to those countries, which seems pretty difficult. But at the same time, looking at the whole issue from a regional perspective, I embarked on a regional operation. And so the fundamental issue was, so there have been a lot of humanitarian agencies, the UNHCR has been there. So what would an institution like the World Bank bring to the table? I mean, what role should we be playing? I think that was the fundamental question I had to deal with. So when we say we're bringing a development response, so the issue was, so what does that really mean? I mean, how is it different from what's happening? So I just wanted to share just a few points in terms of how we see, the projects that we are working on to be slightly different. For once, it's inclusive development. We are not looking at refugees, host communities, migrants as separate entities. We're looking at them as comprehensive entities, right? People who need support. As much as humanitarian response is needed for refugees who've just come newly, they're equally vulnerable people in the host communities who need a similar response. So in that sense, I mean, there's very little that separates. And at the same time, if you're building skills in the host communities, there are very many people in the refugee communities who have, who've been doctors, dentists, I mean, engineers. I mean, it's amazing what you see, but I guess the way we have approached it hasn't been to recognize refugees as skilled people, as human capital that needs to be built on. So the second part is the whole attention has been traditionally in these areas about just life-saving, care and maintenance. Now moving that to more self-reliance, building resilience, ability to really work on risks, ability to face risks and resolve risks is an important issue. So what we have tried to do is institute a process of area-based planning where we're trying to create forums where all funding comes together, everybody looks at the community as one and then kind of program for it, building on what exists, rather than, we have the money and we'll spend it kind of attitude. And second issue, we value for money. I mean, one of the issues we've really seen is the whole focus on sustainability from technical, economic, social, environmental, and that's not really been the case where boreholes need to be deepened every second year because nobody looked at source sustainability. So issues like that is something that the bank is trying to bring in. and aligning. I mean, one of the challenges in most of these areas is parallel service delivery. I mean, you have the local governments and you have refugee camps and people who run them as two very different, So how do you bring these issues back into local plans, national plans, sub-regional plans, so that, the government takes responsibility for all the infrastructure that's developed, so it stays? Implementation is through local governments. I mean, it is true that most of these areas have local governments that are extremely weak. I mean, it's a chicken and egg. So money doesn't flow because there's no capacity, but then unless you build capacity, I mean, how will money flow? So the way we have done, and it's a huge risk, is to just have the project implemented by the local government and to provide as much capacities so that they are able to do the job. The second issue is about communities. We have always looked at communities as partners and not as recipients. I think that has been a very important, and what you see coming out in these areas, one of the other challenges is that the huge distance between communities and their local governments, because they have never seen the government deliver anything to them. So this has become one way of building that relationship, building credibility, bringing in issues of social accountability, transparency, in terms of, so how much is the money that's coming in, what is it being spent for, and who's responsible for it? At the end of the day, what's coming out? How does the local government take care of the operating costs so that you don't build new schools every single year or health centers? So in that sense, ensuring voices of community in decision-making and implementation, oversight, and definitely of access has been one of the fundamental pillars of our engagement. Since I have very little time, my key takeaways, and I just want to leave you with 4 points. One is that forced displacement and migration in the Horn of Africa is a regional phenomenon, and it needs regional solutions. I mean, you cannot probably work with just single countries and expect results, because there is a major spillover effect of so in terms of, I think, for regional stability or socioeconomic development or shared prosperity, we absolutely need to look at both from a regional perspective, but also enter the conversation on multiple fronts, from a security, from a governance, from an economic development, from an inclusive development perspective. The second is the whole forced displacement and mixed migration nexus. It is very, very difficult on the ground to really differentiate what's happening. I mean, you look at Djibouti, you will not find people from the age group of 14 to 35, both in the refugees and the host communities. They're all gone. So you cannot say only refugees are moving or host community, and that's the reality. So how does one bring together solutions that, that actually acknowledge this continuum and have solutions and, people come together? The third is a development response. I mean, what we have seen is more humanitarian and security perspective of responses, but bringing in a development response is critical, because whether we like it or not, we're all trying our best, but 25 years we haven't found solutions. It'll take some time before a Somalia or a South Sudan stabilize. Given that transitional solutions are critical, we've done a lot of work on what local social economic integration look like. Nobody's talking about nationalization. I mean, we're not talking about political economy issues, but simple things like, and there are enough studies to show that local integration is beneficial for both local communities and refugees. So if we could embark on those, on that path for before permanent solutions are found. And the last point I want to make is on gender-based violence. This is a pervasive challenge in the area, not least because of the entrenched norms and practices, but women, girls, and boys, and probably men also, are really, really suffering, and conflict and insecurity has just made the problem worse. So I think that's a focus that needs attention of itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Varalakshmi. I appreciate that. I'm just absolutely stunned at your number of the average years of 25 or more spent in a refugee camp. I think both, it's just stunning that has become acceptable. Somehow I feel our refugee protocol probably needs to be revisited at some point. But thank you so much for that. Gashaw. Over to you. I must say you look
Yeah.
really good in your Ethiopian finery.
Okay.
Let's go.
That's good.
You good?
Okay. Thank you very much for your coming and joining us for this discussion. My research is focused on the cross-border intergroup conflicts in the Horn of Africa, a case study of Ethiopia and the South Sudan borderland people. For your understanding and follow the finding of the research and my presentation, I want to forward 5 questions. The first question is focused on what are the borderland people problems? Second, focus on how this problem manifested on the borderland people. Third one is focus on the major challenges over the region. And the fourth one, what kind of effort that the governments of South Sudan and Ethiopia are trying to give to tackle these problems. And the last one is the recommendation and conclusion part, which is focused on how can we break the cycle of conflicts over that region. So overview of the conflict in the Horn of Africa, that as we know, the Horn of Africa is an insecure region in terms of conflicts and instability, and also the terrorist threat corridor along the presence of Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Most international borders in this region are not formally demarcated, and they have no clear border policy, and they become porous, contested, and fragile, and because of this, they are suitable to circulation of small arms, illicit trade, and the other illegal movements, and which investigate the contributors to intensity of conflict. So the center-periphery relation is also disconnected in this region in terms of economic, social, and political developments. And because of this, the borderland communities are marginalized and unshielded from the external pressure. One example for this situation is the Ethiopia-South Sudan borderland region. Ethiopia and South Sudan share 874 kilometers. This border is not formally demarcated. So the borderland people who are living along this region are the Anywa, who are living in Ethiopia and South Sudan. They are agriculturalist people. And the second one is the Nuer, who are living both in Ethiopia and South Sudan. They are pastoralists. And the third one is the Murle community, who are living in the South Sudan along the Boma and Pibor area. They are pastoralist group. And many other ethnic groups are also living in that region from the central part of Ethiopia and South Sudan for economic purpose. The problems are those peoples suffer from lack of infrastructure and education, exclusion from economic, social, and state services, and also they are affected by cross-border intergroup conflicts. The second problem for this region, the South Sudanese government's lack of inclusion of these people in development, implementation, and due to political instability and weak institutional capacity. The third one is the insufficient economic diversification of Ethiopia due to the low economic development status of the semi-autonomous regional state of Gambela. So how this problem manifested on the borderland people? So the porous border and weak local administration together contribute to the intensity of illicit trade, smuggling of goods, and circulation of small arms in that environment. So these illegal traders use this open border for just like the circulation of small arms, as you have seen on the picture, and what kind of machine gun is available in that environment. So the proliferation of small arms is a serious threat to the peace and security, particularly for the pastoralist people. In this regard, the users in that environment adopt no gun, no life slogan to strengthen their community and compete to have guns. That means they don't have life without gun. Gun is power for them. Gun is life for them. Gun is food for them. They couldn't survive without gun if they don't have gun. So they label each other as enemy of one another, and they want to protect their groups from the attack of external group. So with the availability of small arms, the cattle raiding and child abduction become very frequent and fatal in that environment. So the civilians killed, child abducted, cattle raided from the neighboring communities. So most fighting results or ended with many casualties from both sides. The winner destroys villages, rustled cattle, and abduct children. The insurgents of the Murule group killed more people, abduct more children, and raided more cattle from the communities that are not well protected, particularly the Anywa and Jikanyuer of Ethiopia. This frequency of cattle raiding and child abduction is increased since 2010, as you have seen on the table. So the graph shows the increment of the cattle raiding and child abduction by the Murule insurgents from the Ethiopian community. For instance, in 2010, 900 cattle rustled, 72 children abducted, and 247 civilians killed, and also 21 villages destroyed, around 4,000 people displaced from the Akobo, Gog, and the Jor area. So recently, in 2016, also the Murule insurgents destroyed an Anywa mini village in Gog and killed 16 civilians and abducted 6 children. What you have seen in the picture, I was arrived immediately during time of attack. The first picture shows the grave of the dead person, and the second picture shows how the regional police force arrived and visit the destroyed village. And third picture shows how the people start to move to find the safest place. 2 weeks later, organized Murule insurgents ambushed 3 districts of the Nuer zone and killed 208 people, rustled 2,000 cattle, and abducted 131 children. So this repeated cattle cross-border attack cost the lives of many people, rustled many cattle, and detached hundreds of children from their mother, and produced massive destruction and displacement along that region. So what are the major reasons that develop the hostile relation between the different communities? The first reason, the reason for beyond the daily or cattle raiding and child abduction is the improper distribution of the limited resources, natural resources. The second reason is that lack of proper natural resource management. Third one is intrinsic cultural assumptions that influence the local people. And the fourth one is the influence of the climate change. So what are the challenges along this region? The first challenge is the border porousness. As you have seen in the picture, that people cross the border without any legal documents and without any control. And illicit trade, smuggling of goods, and circulation of light weapon actively participate in this area. And second one is the influx of the political instability of South Sudan. Because of the instability of South Sudan, people distracted in more, and they don't have any infrastructure, education. Yeah. Look how the students learn along the border region. And also the third one is the fractured interaction of the borderland people. And the fourth one is disintegration of state and customary institutions, that the government couldn't include the borderland region customary institutions to implement rule of law and control conflicts along the border. So what are the efforts of the government? Ethiopia and South Sudan trying to sign a memorandum of understanding and security agreement since 2012 to undertake the issue of security along the border region. And followed by their agreement, Ethiopia trying to construct road, disarmed all armed groups, established illicit trade, to control the illicit trade activities along the border, and regulate cross-border trading system, and provide scholarship opportunity for South Sudan students. On the other hand, South Sudan government also tried to disarm the armed groups through military operation, but they have not succeeded. So the government's efforts have some gaps. The first gap of the government's effort to tackle the cross-border intergroup conflicts are their efforts focus on the manifestation of conflict rather than addressing the root causes. Second, Ethiopia successfully disarmed the armed groups, but could not provide protection mechanism for the people who disarmed. The third one is the government of South Sudan has been unable to disarm the armed groups due to the political instability and ethnic tensions. And the fourth one, and the major gap of the two governments' effort, is both governments have not coordinated the process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration with security sector reforms. So because of this, their efforts failed because their security gaps and lack of strong institution, South Sudan's political instability, and insufficient economic diversification. So the conclusion and recommendation part. In terms of conclusion, the porousness of Ethiopia and South Sudan border, coupled with South Sudan's political instability, aggravates the suffering of the borderland people and exacerbates their intergroup conflicts. So the borderland communities are vulnerable to many multifaceted challenges and develop hostile relations due to weak border security management, resource security, resource scarcity, South Sudanese instability, disintegration of state and customary institutions, and center-periphery disconnection. So to reduce the cycle of conflict along the border region, the stability of South Sudan is one of the major steps. So thus the issue of South Sudan's political instability, border demarcation, cattle raiding and child abduction, center-periphery disconnection, zero-level development implementations, weak institutional capacities, infrastructure, and education should take serious attention along the borderland region. So the governmental, regional, and international actors should address security sector reform, integrated development, institutional reforms, border social policy, proliferation of small arms, revitalization of customary institutions, and the borderland resource management. These are what I want to forward the recommendation for the concerned body. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much to all three of our speakers for really deep presentations and analysis, as well as highlighting the core issues as they see them from their various perspectives. So let's now open it up to Q&A. What I'm going to do is I will take 3 questions at a time. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone. And then once you have the microphone in your hand, please identify yourself by your name and the organization with which you're affiliated, if any. And then identify the speaker to whom you're addressing your comment or question. And you have exactly 1 minute to ask your question. But before I do that, I really do want to reach out to both Ambassador Sheen and Ambassador Lyman, because they have worked these issues for a very, very long time. So I will start off with them. Not to put you on the spot, but I'm sure this is not the first time this has happened. So I see Ambassador Lyman over there and Ambassador Sheen right behind him.
You've laid out a whole series of conflicts dating back decades in the Horn of Africa, and I think rightly described it as one of the most conflicted regions of the world, particularly since the end of World War II. And you've also drilled down into a couple of the more serious, more immediate problems, particularly involving South Sudan. I guess my question would be, as you look to the future, and this is not directed towards any particular member of the panel, but as you look towards the future, how do you see the situation in South Sudan playing out vis-a-vis its immediate neighbors? You have the refugee problem, obviously. Some of those refugees have been in those countries for a long time, but try to take this 5-10 years ahead, and what are we looking at here?
Thank you, Ambassador Sheen. Ambassador Lyman?
Thank you, and thanks to the presenters for a very fine presentation. I want to fix on this border population issues that Tasew talked to. And I wonder if it isn't even more complex than you've suggested. You've talked about the Murle attacks, but there have been attacks on the Murle as well. And I wonder if both Ethiopia and South Sudan have attempted to use those groups against each other. How much have they been incorporated into some of the conflicts? Or, for example, when EJ mentioned Egypt's association with South Sudan, there were reports that both sides were talking about arming various groups back and forth. And I wonder if you had more information on that.
We'll take one more question. There's a gentleman right next to Ambassador Langley right there.
Thank you. My name is Ali Verji. I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace. My question is for Ato Tasew. You mentioned in terms of the reasons for antagonistic relationships between the border peoples. One thing you didn't mention was the fact of displacement itself, the shift in the demographic balance in Gambela, for example, as a result of the influx of refugees from South Sudan. So one question for you is, do you see any changes in Gambela as a result of the demographic change that has resulted from the conflict and the resulting displacement? Do you feel that the fact that this displacement occurred in the early part of the South Sudan conflict, so in 2013, 2014, and not so recently, there hasn't been as much displacement across that border? Is there a difference now between what might have been expected to have happened in that area and what has happened? And do you see any consequences longer term for Gambela and for the broader border region as a result of what you've portrayed as potentially a very long-term situation? Thank you.
All right, so three very, very good questions and comments. The first one, I think this is really you, EJ, from Ambassador Shin, and looking out 5-10 years from now and how you see the situation playing out with regard to South Sudan and its neighbors. What does that look like? What are the major lines or issues that we should be following in terms of what will inform where we are 5 to 10 years from now? And then the second one really had to do with the complexity of the borderline conflict, asking you to dig a little bit deeper and perhaps broadening out the scope of your analysis to look at the possibility that perhaps governments may have used these borderland people as a tool in terms of their larger objectives, national interests and larger objectives when you look at the picture more broadly. And then the third one, looking at the impact of demographic changes, particularly with regards to displacement, and how this plays into that picture as well. So let me start with EJ, and then I'll just swing down to you, and then to Varalakshmi, and then we'll go from there. EJ.
Well, I get the easy one, I guess. I mean, how to answer this? I mean, I think the best way to do it is to present two separate scenarios that I think are possible, at least within the Horn, and particularly when it comes to South Sudan. I guess the more hopeful one would be that you would actually get the region, particularly the IGAD member states, and I would mention specifically Sudan, Ethiopia, and Uganda to kind of cooperate around some kind of a strategy for stabilizing, or at least relatively stabilizing, South Sudan, and that they are able to do that in kind of a more institutional setting, so that enables them to sustain that effort for this medium to longer period of time, where I think it would then be possible for the region to put a lot of pressure on Salva Kiir and other political elites in South Sudan to do more of the right things rather than less of them, and to try to move the political process forward and to slowly start rebuilding the state and at least some semblance of national unity. Unfortunately, I do think that that's quite difficult at this point in time from my particular vantage point. We all know that a number of these states are quite distracted, particularly Ethiopia right now, by its own internal problems. I think Sudan is in a little bit better position than it has hitherto been. We'll see what Uganda is able to do. But I think, facilitating this kind of coordination or enabling this kind of coordination is going to be quite difficult on the regional level. It would be easier if there were a major power out there that would say, well, we need to own this problem and try to coordinate these actors in a partnership kind of a way, something of a role which Obama played a couple of years ago quite helpfully in terms of trying to push the peace process in South Sudan. Unfortunately, I don't see anyone right now on the international scene playing that particular role. So that gets me to the second scenario, which is I think you are going to have a South Sudan that's going to look very much like a CAR, like a Central African Republic, where you essentially see the withering of whatever state apparatus remains, and you see essentially the emergence of a city-state, where Juba is figuratively and formally the state, and it exerts fairly limited territorial control beyond the capital, where whatever resources it is able to generate are being captured by elites within the capital at the expense of people in the rest of the country, and that the best we could then hope for is that the different regional neighboring states are able to contain the conflict rather than be able to solve it. But I do think that absent a more proactive initiative by a major power or perhaps the UN, that is the most likely scenario for South Sudan in the next 5 to 10 years, unfortunately. It's something we hope to prevent, but yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have two questions which is related with the communities incorporated within the government trying to give a solution for that cross-border intergroup conflicts. So the government of Ethiopia and South Sudan trying to give a solution for that community related with their political and economic integration of the national and regional level. And at the regional level, the two governments, particularly the Upper Nile and Mayotte County and the Gambela regional state, trying to give a solution for the community. But in case of the communities to incorporate within their solution, the major problem is the government not integrate the traditional institutions. The communities are governed by their own traditional institutions. About the Anya community and the Nuer also, they have their own traditional institutions. The Murle community also, they have their own traditional institutions. But the government administrative structure is not incorporated the traditional institutions. That because of this, the users are sometimes joined to the government institution and sometimes joined to their traditional institutions and playing game between the traditional institution and the government structure, just like users along the border region, just like the son which is grown up within the divorced family that living here and there, and then no one can control them. And they playing their own game, and they start to consider that the elders are just like the uncivilized group, and because they have an option to go to the government structures, and because of this, the government also not incorporated the traditional institutions and is unable to control the environment over that region, and that's the case that the government and the second one is that the influxes of refugees that sometimes, in some ways, it's changed the demographic nature of the Gambela regional state. I know it. And in Gambela, the refugee group is considered at their home, not just they couldn't feel just as refugee people. They are just feel as they live in their own home country, because the difference between the South Sudan and Gambela people are culturally and socially, they are similar, a Nilotic group. And because of this, they feel just as they stay at their home. So they understand that they have equal right with the host community, and they actively participate within the community just like any other. And sometimes the host community also enter into the refugee camp to get ration and the like, because they change their name and enter to the refugee camps. And because of the situation is, I think the problem is the majority of the South Sudan refugee people live in South Sudan, in Gambella, and it's better to distribute in other regional states rather than put all of them within the Gambella regional state. And because of the demographic situation is already changed, I think. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
On South Sudan, just from perspective of a hosting country, I mean, both Uganda and Kenya, we've been supporting operations, and they're looking at the next 10 years of these refugees just staying. And so they are looking at how do you invest in the refugees so that there's greater self-reliance. They're able to contribute to themselves, their households, but also to the economy. So it's everybody is looking at a 10-year horizon at least for any solution. So I think in one sense, one can look at those, that perspective. And on Gambella, because I visited Gambella very recently, I mean, and I've been working on South Sudan for the last 5 years, it's like South Sudan has just, taken over Gambella. And in a lot of Veredas and Kabeles, the host communities are way less. I mean, it's like 200% more of refugees. So they feel disenfranchised in their own settings. And that has led to a lot of friction in terms of, these are, unfortunately, Gambella is among the very poor regions. It's also the emerging regions, which has been traditionally under invested in. And so that additional pressure, and not all refugees go and live in refugee camps, so because they can afford to live outside, they look so similar, culturally it's very easy. And that actually exacerbates the situation, and that's what one is looking at. I mean, they're trying to move some of them to Benchangul Gumus, but then again, you again hit the cultural differences, right? So then it's not that easy for integrations. It has its own problems of moving these people along other regions, because there's also a cultural issue to that, yeah.
Thank you. I'll take another round of 3 questions. I see you, but let me swing a little bit this way to create some balance. I'll get to you. So let me start with my sister right here in the gray sweater.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm Faustine Wabwira with Bread for the World. Just really delighted to hear about all of the insightful comments you raised. I'm grappling with a policy paper right now to exactly your point, Ms. Varalakshmi, about bridging the humanitarian development divide. And I think, just thinking about the first humanitarian summit that happened in 2016, we recognize that international institutions, including humanitarian law, for example, is not as strong as could be to help us cope with the largest migration crisis that we're facing today. Which then brings us to the issue of recognizing, for example, the statistic you gave, the average stay of a refugee in a camp being 25 years. But at the same time, we see that resources tend to flow into responses that are humanitarian and emergency, and less about the long-term planning that you're talking about. So I'm just interested in hearing more. What are some of the innovative, community-driven initiatives that perhaps you've worked on in settings that are complicated like this, that have the potential to be scaled up and attract more attention from policymakers?
I think that was my brother right there.
John Thorne Majuk with the Wilson Center. What is the one thing, the one response that is immediate to the intergroup conflict at the border that you think from your research? It seems to me that it's more about the immediacy of the response should be determined by the security situation followed by development, because as you describe, the incident of attacks by the Morale or the Nuer along the border has been increasing. So what is the immediate response from your research and from also working with the local people there? Now, the slogan, no guns, no lives, I think say it all, what the youth are experiencing there at the border. So from the development perspective, should we substitute that? You know, no guns, there is life. How is the World Bank working to address that too, especially at the border region? Because I think those issues between the local group escalate to the regional level. So I think we should start from the bottom up. But I will end there.
All right, thank you. Let me swing right here, Tim. I'll get you in the next round.
Good morning. Thank you. This is Miskana from Ethiopian Embassy. My comment or question is to Dr. AJ. I absolutely agree with some of your comments on the regional challenges. However, I was wondering that you didn't say some of the positive developments on the region in terms of economic, infrastructure, and power connectivity, as well as the security and humanitarian cooperations. Saying this with regard to the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is the biggest dam in Africa, it has to be clear that Ethiopia is the source and almost entirely contributor of the Nile River. Therefore, as Ethiopian economy is growing significantly, the decision to build on this river comes on the basis of with no significantly harming the low riparian countries. I can share with you that there were concerns from initially from low riparian countries, but as diplomatic engagement continues, there is positive developments in the region. So how it will continue as a source of tension with regard to this dam? Thank you.
Okay, so there's a comment there from my brother from the Ethiopian Embassy. I think really to the heart of it, contesting your view about the tension that surrounds the dam by offering a different perspective of all the work that has been done at the diplomatic level to minimize that tension. So do you have anything else to add on that? I think that's for you, EJ. To both Varalakshmi and Tasew, I think a couple of questions about how you flip the no gun, no life slogan to one where there is life without guns. What is it going to take to move from that mindset to the mindset where people feel they can survive without a gun? What sort of interventions do we need to make in that space? And then for you directly, Tasew, the question about what is the most immediate driver of cross-border conflict. And then finally, I think this was to you, Varalakshmi, the question about the broader resource allocation issues in terms of where they are directed from the immediate humanitarian crisis to getting people out of a crisis situation, that there seems to be an imbalance there with most of the resources being focused on the immediate humanitarian crisis and very little on the other work that needs to be done to get people out of that crisis situation. But also more importantly, a question about programs that we could scale up that have perhaps been shown to work at that pilot level that could be scaled up to address some of the issues that Bread for the World and others like you are working on. So I'll flip it this time. Let me start with you and work it in this way.
Sure. I think one of the good things that's happening is, because it's a time of scarcity, right? The humanitarian monies are really, really going down. And so it's forcing everybody to think outside the box. I've seen cases where water has been trucked for refugees for 10 years. I mean, how can something like that happen, right? It's happened because we haven't asked the right questions. So one of the issues I recently confronted was, we can only have 30 kids to a class. That's what our donors say. I'm like, What good is that when 50% of your refugee kids are outside classes? I mean, so I'm not saying make it 100, but can we kind of really have a negotiation on these issues, right? So who's setting these standards? So I think these are some of there are no givens anymore. And one of the challenges I've seen is you cannot have a humanitarian response for refugees for 10 years. They don't want that. They want something else. I think it's been the inability of humanitarian agencies to respond or even recognize and respond to that varying aspirations, right? There is nothing empowering in the way things are done. Everything is handed over. And I've interacted with so many refugees, and they say, there's no dignity to me, right? Dignity to my life. So you can do these things, but do it in, provide them the skills, provide them the resources, and they'll take care of themselves and they'll take care of their families. So flipping that whole concept around has been, and what I'm very encouraged by is we've found a lot of partnerships. I mean, people are coming, and there's lots of agencies are, in fact, blurring the lines between their humanitarian response and their development response. So it's like, yes, you can do the first 1 year when it's required, but then can we move quickly to more typically water? Instead of trucking it, can we have a water system? Can that system also look after the host communities? I mean, why is it that, we need to maintain a 40-liter per capita standard for refugees, where the host communities, whose water you're using to provide for refugees, drink dirty water from a stream? So I think that mindset is something that's changing. It's also, because of the situation. And a lot of these examples of communities becoming central to their own development, communities making the decisions, demanding what they want, is a very different paradigm. And it's worked in many contexts, and that's what we have brought to this situation. And at the same time, bringing a government and the community close and negotiating each other's space, right? So making that. So I think these are models that are absolutely applicable, even in a humanitarian response, where you are not, there's no patronage involved, right? It's about, can we do this together? And it's a job we're all doing. So I think that flipping is. And just on the borderlands, I mean, the bank is very, very conscious, be it Nigeria, be it Kenya, be it Ethiopia, that the border areas, those regions which are not, kind of removed from the center, are not traditionally where we've invested, because the risks are very high. But then it's like, if you're talking about inclusive growth, if you're talking about everybody getting a chance, this cannot be the way you function. I mean, yes, the risks will be high, but then we need to put all our resources in and really make investments in these regions. So that has really shifted in the last couple of years. We're moving into the more difficult areas, and our appetite for risk, especially for borders, really increased. And so we're being actually now challenged to see what are these new models you can work in these areas, because fundamentally, if livelihoods don't improve, services are not available, people don't feel a sense of identity and belongingness, it doesn't matter whatever happens, these conflicts will continue, because those are the fundamental issues. They just get manifested in different forms.
Tasew?
Okay. The situation in the borderland region is very, very terrible. Now, when we trying to give immediate response for the people who are the insurgent groups of the Murule, their activity is not set a time of 1 year or just like this. This is their traditional practice. Their traditional practice is throughout a year. From a year, they select 3 months, February, March, and April, dry time. That time is a very important time for them to collect cattle, to raid cattle, and to kidnap children from other community. That is their yearly activity. It's already just as a culture. So the immediate response from the government is only in 2016 that the organized Murle group attacked the Nuer community of the 3 districts in Nuer zone, and they abducted more than 100 children. And only that time that the government organized it and media give attention for that situation and trying to back some of 93 children to their family. The rest also still live in Murle community. And previously, yearly, such kind of activity is it's normal for them. It's just they couldn't consider they collect cattle from other area because they believe a cultural intrinsic assumption what they have is all cattle in the world belongs to them. See? Okay. This cultural assumption is already inculcated in their mind. It is institutionalized in their mind. What I discussed with the cross-border region, they have enmity with Dinka Poor. They have enmity with Lone Nuer in South Sudan. They have enmity with Toposa and the like. Not only with the Jikany Nuer in Ethiopia and the Anywa community. They have also considered that labeled the borderland people are their enemy because the Lone Nuer have close attachment with cattle, the Jikany Nuer close attachment with cattle, Dinka also close attachment with cattle. Because of cattle, they labeled all these communities are their enemy. So it's too difficult. It's grown up from the childhood, they feed their culture and they assimilate the people who are collected from other area. And they have their own philosophy. That is, if they enlarge their number, there is a possibility to control and monopolize the natural resources, cattle over that region. So they need to enlarge their number. That's why they abduct children from other community. The other thing, what they abduct children from other community also to exchange the cattle with cattle. So one children, if it is female, they can exchange with 50 cattle. If it is boy, it's male, 100 cattle. This is another means of income for them. So in what way the government, the South Sudan government now currently is unstable, and the society along the border also left without any government protection. The immediate response from the government of Ethiopia is not successful. It's not saved the community. Already the Ethiopian government disarmed the Anywa community and the Jikany Nuer community from the Ethiopian side. So they don't have any protection mechanism except the defense force of the Ethiopian government and also the special force of the Gambela regional state. This is a very difficult situation, and the immediate response for them is not, I think it's difficult. So the situation is continuing. It needs the basic reform that changing the mind of the people. And the second thing, what the no life, it's possible to have another solution for them. But in that environment, currently, they use gun, and they believe that gun is for self-protection. Self-protection. If they don't have gun, the Murle community may attack by other group. So who can save them from from the attack of other ethnic groups? Because every community along the border label each other as enemy of one another, and they want to protect themselves from the external enemy and focused on the in-group and out-group formation. That's of course, the divide and rule policy of the British colonial system also still the fossil around that region, because the political elites also manipulate the ethnic groups along the border because they want to highly attachment with their own ethnic group as protection, and people need to have a smooth relation with their own ethnic group rather than making cultural, social, and any other economic activity with other groups.
Okay.
So it is difficult to, I think.
Thank you. EJ, just 1 minute to, I mean, he wouldn't be a good diplomat if he didn't defend his government, but, you know, up to you to address that question.
Well, I mean, you know, very quickly, I mean, clearly, I mean, I support development in Africa, and I certainly support, you know, creating economic opportunities for people in the Horn of Africa. I guess all I would suggest is that development can also create conflict. And so we just have to be very careful about it, right? I mean, the introduction of mechanized agricultural schemes to increase agricultural productivity means there are larger farms, but also means that subsistent farmers lose their land. You know, infrastructure projects move people away from their traditional homes. You know, the expansion of the Addis Ababa capital regional region for economic purposes created tensions. You know, building dams on rivers creates tensions. You know, the dams on the Omo River, for example, have created downstream effects in Lake Turkana in Kenya. And I'm not saying that these projects should not be put in place. I'm just saying that one needs to anticipate what conflicts it can and probably will create. And then it does become a diplomatic challenge, and one which I hope can be resolved diplomatically, but it's my job to kind of raise some of these issues. The reality is that while there have been very helpful diplomatic initiatives, if you go to Cairo or if you go to Addis Ababa and you look at the newspapers, there are accounts that are fairly hostile of the other side, that question what the other side is doing, and this largely plays around the Grand Renaissance Dam. But as suggested, there's also two issues. One is this question of the fill rate, which I think is important because that's a short-term problem, right? And to some degree, that's a really easy one to resolve diplomatically because it's essentially an agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia over how quickly you fill the reservoir. And then it becomes putting in place a mechanism in which Egypt believes that Ethiopia is going to do that in agreement with whatever has been negotiated. I think the larger issue is a trickier one, but one that I think it's important to discuss, which is if you regularize the flow of water down the Blue Nile, that is going to create incentives downriver to farm land via irrigation schemes. If you irrigate farmland in Sudan, that water is no longer going to flow down to Egypt. That's a fact. Now, is that a good thing? Probably in the respects for the development of Sudan. But does that have negative consequences for Egypt? Yes. Is that something that could be resolved diplomatically? Yes, but it needs to be addressed. It needs to be resolved diplomatically. And if people ignore those issues, then it becomes a source of tension between Ethiopia and Egypt. It has a potential of bringing other countries into this dispute. And in my view, it is one major source of friction amongst a number of states in the Horn that we need to be looking at in an impartial and unbiased way, if at all possible.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I did promise you I'd take one more question, make it 30 seconds, because I'm fast out of time. In fact, I just have a minute, so.
Richard Bone, I'm soon at the Elliott School. I'm just curious, what role do all these cross-border raids have in the overall South Sudan conflict? Because all the atrocities that we hear about happening in the conflict are being described in what these border groups are doing. So what role do they have in the overall conflict?
30 seconds, Tasew.
Okay. South Sudan conflict is really the influx to the contribute to the cross-border intergroup conflict is because without the stability of South Sudan, it is difficult to solve the cross-border intergroup conflict. It's because South Sudan is unable to address the community who are living along the border region need infrastructure, need education, need any other development implementation. So the South Sudan government, because of this conflict, is unable to address this development implementation along the borderland region, and the borderland communities are not incorporated into the development system of the government. So the influxes of the conflict, also the South Sudan instability, also produced the circulation of small arms along the borderland region, as no one controlled the circulation of small arms along that region. So this situation makes terrible the situations of the borderland region. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me give Varalakshmi 30 seconds to conclude your final thoughts, and EJ 30 seconds as well with your final thoughts.
Well, what can I say? This is one of the most challenging regions, but also something that forces you to think, forces you to look at it from a multiple perspective. At least for us, we are looking at a developmental solution, and I think that could be could actually help resolve quite a few of other aspects as well. I mean, yes, as you know, the lack of, the fundamentals remain that people feel disenfranchised, people do not see a future, people do not see development, people do not see what will happen to their kids. So if we are able to have parallel interventions of diplomacy, security, development, I think we all need to come together. I think there's no two, opinions about that.
Well, just very quickly, I think that Tasew gave an excellent example of a case study of farmer-herder conflict in South Sudan and Ethiopia, or the South Sudan-Ethiopia border region. But I would argue that, it's very similar, very, very complicated socio and economic dynamics are also playing out along the entire Saharan Sahel belt of the continent. And that, when we think about Merle, Anulak or Merle, Dinka conflict, this is something that we're seeing all across Africa, and this is tied not to just climate change, but it's also tied to lots of demographic pressures. All these populations are exploding to a certain degree. So you've got, a finite amount of land, arguably, amount of land that's reducing because of drought and desertification. But then you have larger and larger populations, and not just larger and larger populations of people, but larger and larger populations of cattle as well. And that is a very, very tricky regional and continental problem that I think we haven't really paid enough attention to.
Well, thank you so much. I think our speakers this morning have done a wonderful job of just laying out the key issues, and we've run out of time, so I'm not going to give my summary except to say three things. I think the first thing that they have said that sticks in my mind is we have to remember the backdrop against which we're talking about the Horn of Africa insecurity and instability. In many ways, I would characterize this region as a region in which the governments, given a variety of tools in their toolbox to resolve issues, have inevitably almost always landed on the gun as a way of resolving tools, and other tools haven't been used as effectively as they could have been used to minimize the insecurity in the region. And I think one of the other things that comes out to me also is this, and this was put out by all of our actors, that the Horn of Africa is becoming even more complex because the range of actors is broadening out to include Middle East and other actors from around that region, which means that insecurity is becoming even more fragile and complex, if you will. And that it's really important that we understand this point that EJ made about the lack of confidence building measures and the lack of trust. That we have seen this lack of trust just go generation after generation after generation in the region. So one of the issues has to be, how do we break that cycle? I think is a core part of this discussion. I like that all of our speakers really talked about solutions, and you gave us some potentially good solutions. Although I do think in giving those solutions, I think you all acknowledge that this is going to be difficult and a long-term effort. So I won't go through those solutions. But Gashaw, let me get back to your point, finish on a point that you made. You were asked the question of the immediate cause of some of the cross-border issues that you're dealing with or you're seeing in that region. And I think part of the region that the answer that you gave had to do with, it's a cultural way of doing things, what those cultures value. And that is what they're going to do year after year after year. Then perhaps as you look at solutions, one of the things I'd advise you to do is to define that value and look at things that you can put to substitute for that value. So instead of cattle raiding, what could we put in place and inculcate within that community as something that gives them the same intrinsic value that they saw in the cattle that they're raiding? And how do you then begin to bring this new value system into that particular culture? I also think that criminalizing some of this behavior ought to be something that is done as well. But how you do that, how you sequence it, and how you begin to do that alongside the public education is also something that I think you could look at over the long term. So I thank you all. We're in a difficult situation in the Horn of Africa. I wish I had the answers. I have none. But I think this forum has been very good for understanding the challenges, understanding the current state of play, but also offering some solutions. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a really good job.